Oki ambawastich danit ada tonshe, and hello everyone. My name is Michaela Ritchie and I'm a community learning advocate at Calgary Public Library, and I'd like to begin today's program in a good way by acknowledging the land on which we're gathered. With gratitude, mutual respect, and reciprocity, we acknowledge the ancestral homes, cultures, and oral teachings of the Treaty 7 signatories, including the Siksika Nation, Piikani Nation, Kainai Nation, the Iithka-Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. The City of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to the Otipemisiwak Métis government, Métis Nation Battle River Territory, Nose Hill Métis District 5, and Elbow Métis District 6. At Calgary Public Library, we celebrate stories, the stories of the community and the lands that we live on. We serve the community on Winchispa, Gutissi, and Mokinstis, which describes the gathering place where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet. We respect all people who share, celebrate, and care for the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta, and we honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us. We recognize our shared responsibilities going forward to help bring everyone together on this journey of truth and reconciliation. Before we begin tonight's program, we have a few housekeeping reminders. In case of emergency, please note that the Central Library has a two-stage alarm. The first alarm is only a warning and we invite you to remain where you are, but if we do need to evacuate, there will be a second alarm. If that happens, please head up the stairs and through the main doors, or exit through the stage doors to your left and out through the lower level of the building. The nearest washrooms are through the main theater doors to your left and down the hall beside the Welcome Gallery stairs. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and as well to our presenters for joining us. I know that the weather has been something this week. At Calgary Public Library, we work to connect people with inspiration, ideas, and insight. This is a mission that we share with partners like those at the University of Calgary. Tonight, we'll all participate in a dialogue regarding the teaching of diverse religious traditions, led by our friends at the Calgary Interfaith Council and the Chair of Christian Thought, in celebration of the United Nations World Interfaith Harmony Week. To tell us more about tonight's program, I'd like to introduce our host for the evening. Dr. Carolyn Muessig is the Chair of Christian Thought at the University of Calgary. She is a specialist in the history of pre-modern Christianity, and as Chair of Christian Thought, she organizes 4 public lectures a year in partnership with the library. She works together with our city's civic institutions, institutions of higher education, and Christian denominations to raise awareness of social matters, as well as support the educational, cultural, and artistic enrichment of our local communities. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Carolyn Muessig.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for that kind introduction. I welcome you all here tonight, along with my co-hosts, the Calgary Interfaith Council and the Calgary Public Library. And we have joined together to organize the annual Chair of Christian Thought Bentall Lecture in Education and Theology. And we are doing this as part of the celebration of UN World Interfaith Harmony Week, hence the letters there, if you were trying to figure out what they were. That's what it stands for. Keeping in the spirit of Interfaith Harmony Week, instead of having a traditional lecture, we are having a panel discussion on teaching global religious traditions in higher education. Now, before we start the panel discussion, I want to say a few words about this endowed lecture in memory of Dr. Howard Bentall and Dr. Shirley Bentall. Howard Bentall had a distinguished career in ministry in the Baptist tradition, and Shirley Bentall, his wife, was president of the Baptist Union of Western Canada from 1976 to 1977, and the first woman president of the Canadian Baptist Federation from 1985 to 1988. The Bentalls spent their last years founding the Rivendell Retreat Center on Bowen Island. The volunteer-run retreat, rooted in values of simplicity and hospitality, welcomes individuals seeking renewal and respite. It is a privilege to hold an annual lecture in education and theology in honor of the Bentalls. Now, tonight, our panel is made up of researchers, teachers, and students connected with the Religious Studies program at the University of Calgary. To streamline this evening, so all panel members have time to speak and so that there is time for audience engagement with a question and answer session, I will briefly introduce the speakers in quick succession. In a short presentation, each speaker will offer their specialized knowledge, examining religion sometimes from a historical, methodological, or contemporary perspective. The discussion will also include student perspectives. And as we close the evening, the Executive Director of the Calgary Interfaith Council, Sarah Arthurs, will make a few announcements, and then we hope you can join us for a bit of chat and refreshments that we'll have up at the top of the room. But tonight, let me first start with the introductions. Our first speaker, unfortunately, who is unwell tonight, but has heroically prepared his talk and his PowerPoint, Dr. Tinu Ruparell, whose interests in philosophy of religion interests span philosophical hermeneutics and cross-cultural interpretation and religion in healthcare and science, among other things. He studies and teaches religious pluralism, interreligious dialogue, and comparative philosophy. And his PhD student, Adam Bedford, will be presenting for Dr. Ruparell. Our second speaker is Chris Schmitz, an undergraduate student in religious studies at the University of Calgary, and he has academic interests focused on Asian religions. After Chris, Dr. Beth Rohlman will speak. Rohlman is a specialist in Hindu studies and researches Sanskrit literature and regional and sectarian religious movements. And her work delves into South Asian religious history and religious geography. Adam Bedford is a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of Calgary, who examines the intersections of religion, medicine, and mental health, focusing on how medicine and religion act as sources of meaning in patients' lives. Dr. Wendi Adamek, raise your hand, specializes in East Asian Buddhism and explores topics such as living systems theory and process philosophy, among many other things. Dr. Joy Palacios researches the history of Christianity, focusing on religion and performance through liturgy, preaching, and the interplay between church and theater, drawing on performance and ritual theory. And our last panel presenter is George Ferzoco, who is a specialist in medieval Christianity in Western Europe. He has taught study abroad programs focusing on Christianity in Italy and Spain. So tonight, Dr. Tinu Ruparell's presentation will be presented by Adam Bedford. Adam, please.
Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Muessig said, my name's Adam Bedford. I'm a PhD student at the University of Calgary, and I'm presenting on behalf of Dr. Ruparell this evening. He did implore me to say that he felt a British accent would give some pathos to his presentation. That is not a sentiment I share. I think his presentation speaks for itself, but let's see how we get on. This paper is about the importance of thinking about comparison when it comes to the study of religion. And of course, asking that question requires us to ask first, what is religion? We will see in the short time we have together this evening that this is perhaps not as easy as it at first appears. So let's begin with a thought experiment. Imagine a non-terrestrial intelligent being from the planet Tralfamadore. Sci-fi fans might pick up the reference there. One great thing about being Tralfamadorian is that they're not bound by time. Indeed, they can witness any timeline as if stretched like a mountain range across the horizon. This means that they see all points in time at once. The bad thing about being Tralfamadorian, however, is they can't change anything in the timeline. They can only observe. A research project for our Tralfamadorian anthropologist is to try to understand the nature of what humans call religion. How would they proceed? The first question is, what would the Tralfamadorian look for? Given their happy ability to observe all points of history at once, I suggest that what they would observe would be constituted by an uncountably large panoply of events. That is, stuff that human beings observably do, as well as the observable products of these actions. These events and their products come in all kinds of diverse forms. Literally anything that humans do or make or have done or made, either alone or in groups, are labeled for the Tralfamadorian an event. So all observable actions, reactions, and effects are events. So far, so good. But what about non-observables? To paraphrase, there is more in heaven and earth, young Tralfamadorian, than appears to your anthropology. This poses an interesting question for our alien. According to the Tralfamadorian, that there should be some reason to account for the features of events being the way they are. Otherwise, all these events would be indistinguishable from a flux of random changes. They propose that there must be something by virtue of which one could account for the particulars of the events, and they decide to call this thing a belief, by which they mean that which apparently accounts for the features of an observable event. So, armed with some theoretical terms, the Tralfamadorian anthropologist decides to press its luck and labels the conglomeration of event plus belief a phenomenon. So, let's take stock. Our alien anthropologist has defined a bunch of terms to try to gain some purchase on this idea of religion. Whatever it is that human beings have loosely called religion seems to include a huge diversity of events, plus another huge diversity of possible beliefs, which together form all the phenomena they call religion. However, the Tralfamadorian seems to have gone from the frying pan into the proverbial fire. Not only does our anthropologist now have to deal with the diversity of observable events, but also they need to consider how all of these events could be connected to beliefs which variously account for the features of the event. If anything, the diversity has increased. So how to manage this problem? Can our anthropologists find some shared features of all these phenomena? Are all events and beliefs potentially religious, or can one prune down the list somehow? What gets included and what doesn't? As with all thought experiments, the goal of the exercise is to propose an abstract and radical example in order for us to be able to see some important feature of that into which we are inquiring. Dr. Ruparell's fanciful thought experiment illuminates something important about the study and teaching of religion. That is the importance of comparison to the project of understanding religion. So what is comparison? As ever, the Oxford English Dictionary gives us a starting point. Comparison is defined as a consideration or estimate of the similarities or dissimilarities between two or more things. Anytime we do any kind of categorizing, we have to consider the similarities and differences of the potential candidates for the category. So what does all this mean for our understanding and teaching of religion? If comparison is crucial for the formation of any and all categories, this will of course include the category of religion. Indeed, I want to say that the whole of the teaching and study of religion amounts to acts of comparison. We teach our students to be careful comparativists. We start with a set of possibles, but we remind ourselves that just because we might have come across something first, it doesn't follow that it takes any pride of place. We also train students to, as much as possible, let the sources speak for themselves. So we teach the original languages and try to grasp the original practices and worldviews. Only then can we consider similarities and differences, that is, compare. The result of comparison is a kind of working model or prototype, but one that never gets finished because the prototype forms the beginning for further comparison in an ongoing hermeneutic circle. I realize that I've gone through this pretty quickly. That's Dr. Ruparell's comment, although I might have read it too quickly too. But a final point is that the hermeneutic nature of categories means that the acts of comparison are never finalized. They only act as the fodder for further comparison, which of course means that the category of religion remains always open to negotiation, revision, and reform. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all well. I want to again thank you for coming to this event in support of Interfaith Harmony Week and Religious Studies in Higher Education. I would also like to thank Dr. Carolyn Muessig for inviting me to speak here today. I am deeply honored and humbled to be able to speak alongside these people who are not only fantastic scholars, but are also the reason for my deep love of this subject and who have set me on this path I'm on today. First, I would like to tell you a little about who I am and what exactly that path is. My name is Chris Schmitz. I am a fourth-year undergraduate student at the University of Calgary, majoring in religious studies and minoring in South Asian studies. I don't want to be presumptuous, but a transgender man is probably not the first person you picture when you imagine a religious studies major, if you imagine anyone at all. If you had asked me 4 years ago, I would have never imagined myself here. In 2020, I had just been fired from my long-term retail job and, in a bid for stability, decided it was time to return to university at the old age of 24. It was my intention to apply for admission to cultural anthropology, but, unable to find the program in a drop-down menu, settled for religious studies instead. I hate to start with a cliche, but it really is true that I come from a small town. I grew up in Invermere, British Columbia, and although the town has become more diverse in the past decade, while I was growing up, it was a primarily white and culturally Christian community. Despite this cultural Christianity, I was raised in an irreligious household. We celebrated Christmas and Easter in the most secular ways. That is to say, religion wasn't on my radar when I was growing up. This, combined with my queer identity, makes me an odd candidate for religious studies education, I'll admit. This wasn't at the top of my mind when I got accepted into the program, however. My intention was to receive an education and hopefully figure out my path as I went along. And I found that path more quickly than I expected. I had my first formal introduction to Asian religions in my first semester of university, and while I had the opportunity to explore many aspects of our program during that first year, something about that introduction clearly stuck with me. Heading into the next year, I enrolled in more classes focusing on Hinduism and took the opportunity to join a seminar where I was first able to read Hindu narrative literature. This, I believe, is where my love of the subject was cemented, and I had well and truly been set on my path. I have continued this journey in the years since, culminating in my last year of university, where I'm currently finishing an undergraduate honors degree with plans to pursue a master's and beyond. I've also received the opportunity to travel to India for research this spring, something I'm so grateful and excited for. Here, I also need to extend a special thank you to Dr. Elizabeth Rohlman, who, through this journey, since my first year of university, has been a steadfast mentor, teacher, and friend. I have no doubts that without her support, I would not be standing here and continuing onwards in academics. Thank you again, Dr. Rohlman. I'm so excited to keep working together. I tell you all of my story, not because I believe this journey is particularly special, but because I believe it is not. When I speak to my fellow religious studies students, I hear journeys that are not dissimilar to my own. The people who take paths like mine are a diverse group whose steps have led them here, even if it isn't straightforward. In fact, I'm a bit of an oddity for directly enrolling into this program. Most of my peers changed their major after starting in a different place, ranging from microbiology to English. It's not my place to tell their stories, but I believe it speaks to something special in what we study, that so many people find fulfillment in a field they had likely never encountered prior to taking a class on a whim. I feel that special something whenever I talk with my classmates. Going from a small town to having the privilege of working with a group with backgrounds wholly different to my own is what makes what we study unique. Yet, despite these differences, I've had nothing but positive, uplifting interactions with everyone I work with. I have learned so much from my peers, and they are a huge factor in why I continue to pursue this scholarship. The dialogue we have is valuable, and every day I'm able to learn more about people and places I could have never imagined growing up. Here is where I believe the true value of religious studies lies, in its ability to teach about each other through the lens of faith, something that everyone, even those without a religion such as myself, can relate to in some way. We use this touchstone to open ourselves to new ideas and ways of thinking, improving not only our scholarship, but the ways we interface with the world and her people. My studies have made me a better, more compassionate, more thoughtful person. I have gained an appreciation for a culture that I previously only knew in passing. To go from that to being able to travel across the world to further that appreciation is something that would never have happened if not for the education I have received at the university. I am very proud that my journey has taken me from Invermere to Ahmedabad, and as I continue, who knows where else I'll end up. As of late, our world seems like an increasingly hostile place. I often worry that distrust and hatred will win the day. But when I come to university and interact with my professors and classmates, I'm reminded of the fact that people are curious, kind, and want the world to be a better place. What we learn in religious studies helps create a more understanding community. We see that we have so much more in common than what separates us. Times like Interfaith Harmony Week is when this is brought to the surface and where I feel hope that we can continue having dialogue and learning together. And while the university is not the only place where we do this, I believe that it is valuable to have these spaces in the higher education, not only for students like myself that dedicate themselves for it, but also for those who want to reconnect to their families' cultures, who want a new perspective on their own religion, or those who come in expecting an easy A, but come out with knowledge on parts of the world they had never considered before. It gladdens me that even in my darkest hour, I can return to my studies and academia knowing that I'm supported and that what I research may help lead the world into a better future. It is my sincere hope that more students will be able to set upon a similar path as me for the betterment of themselves and humanity. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. When Carolyn sent the order of speakers yesterday, I enthusiastically signed off and didn't think about the fact that I'd be all choked up at the beginning of my paper. There are few things that bring all of us here more joy than seeing our students really excel at what they do. And we've thanked everyone for being here, but one of the things I noticed as we were watching people come in is how many of our students are here today. And so we're really grateful to share their presence here with all of you in the community as well. So I will start by saying, I hope not too presumptuously also, that I think the idea for this panel started a year ago at this same event when Carolyn hosted a great panel on neighborliness. And I gave her this suggestion based on one of my intellectual heroes. So I'll start with that. I had initially proposed this idea to Carolyn as an homage to a great scholar of Sanskrit and of Hinduism, Diana Eck, who has written a memoir called From Bozeman to Benares about her travels from a young girl in Montana to becoming one of the world's most celebrated experts in the Hindu sacred city of Varanasi. Her opening essay in this memoir is now a classic methodological essay assigned to undergraduates across North America to introduce them to what scholars of religious studies actually do. I had imagined my own winding story of happy accidents that carried me across the globe, from Detroit to Baroda, and then to end up here in my adopted hometown doing what I do now. Alas, this telling would bring me great joy, but I really doubt that it would fit into the very narrow time frame that we are being kept to. So I start instead simply by giving thanks to Eck, who stands a generation or two behind me in my own personal academic lineage, for showing us all how important it is to reflect on how our own biographies inform our work as scholars and teachers. Now, while I am very much a scholar of Hindu studies, my training and academic identity are at once both much broader and much more precise than that. My doctoral degree is in the history of religion in South Asia, and my training emphasized the reality that it is impossible to understand any single religion of India in isolation. The history of the subcontinent is a history of many religions in constant conversation with one another. Or, as I often tell my undergraduate students here in Calgary, Canada is a nation that is very proud of its religious and cultural pluralism, as it should be. But we must always remind ourselves that India has been a home to religious pluralism for nearly 3 millennia. It is tempting to pause here to reflect on how surprised I am that this pluralistic approach to the history of religions is still considered controversial by some in our field nearly 30 years after I started my graduate education, leading to a field where scholars who specialize in geocultural clusters of traditions are still viewed sometimes with skepticism, as opposed to those who specialize in one single religious tradition. However, it has enriched my life to look at religion in this way, and so I will instead reflect on a more important lesson that I have learned from my decades in this field, and more importantly, from the students I teach in my adopted hometown of Calgary. That is the reality that intra-religious diversity, that is, variation within a single religious tradition, is just as important as, but often far more overlooked than, inter-religious diversity. When I teach undergraduate classes on Hinduism, the most challenging reality for students is grasping the sheer diversity of Hindu belief. And I'll pause here to say that I find this to be challenging for all students, regardless of whether they come from a Hindu heritage or not. There is never a singular answer to a question that begins, does Hinduism teach X? Which is perhaps the origins, or at least I tell myself it's the origins of my reputation for very long answers to students' questions. In fact, what I emphasize to students is that the tradition's ability to absorb and synthesize new ideas seemingly endlessly is what has allowed Hinduism to endure as one of the world's oldest continually practiced religions. But the bigger challenge here is that the diversity of Hinduism shocks students. No Calgarian of any religious identity or of no religious identity at all thinks twice when they drive through our city and see Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican, Catholic, and Pentecostal Christian churches. The default assumption in Canada is that there are many Christian denominations and that each has its own history, beliefs, and rituals. Why then is the variation in Hindu beliefs, or Buddhist beliefs, or Muslim beliefs so surprising? One answer to this question is proposed by the philosopher Jacques Derrida in one of his last books, The Monolingualism of the Other, where he writes that of the reality that in a world irrevocably shaped by centuries of European colonialism, those we view as other are always and irredeemably monolingual, and thus monolithic. To grasp, to understand, to subdue another culture is to render it capable of speaking only in the language of the subduer, and thus of bearing only a passing resemblance to its true self. The conundrum of this colonial construction is that it also renders our own self monolingual and capable of expressing ourselves only in monolith. Or, as Derrida himself writes in the opening pages of this book, I have only one language, but it is not mine. What then does this have to do with teaching South Asian religions here in Calgary? I am always humbled and honored to teach students in my classes who are primarily of South Asian heritage. And what this requires is a sensitivity to the fact that my classrooms contain students of every possible South Asian religious identity, every possible South Asian linguistic heritage, every possible caste background, and every possible complex migration story of the many ways that South Asians have come to Canada over the centuries. And while my own experience is shaped primarily by South Asian traditions, the same is true, I'm confident, of every one of my colleagues here tonight. Every tradition we teach and every classroom we occupy reflects the full religious pluralism of our city and therefore of our globe. Discussing religion with depth, rigor, and sensitivity requires truly multi-perspectival balance, and to be honest, a great deal of thinking quickly on one's feet. It requires, above all else, allowing the multilingual reality of individual religious and cultural identities to be seen, to be heard, and to be appreciated. The other may be intractably monolingual, but the communities forged by us and our classrooms can and do challenge those monolithic identities every day.
Hello again. Well, I don't get to take credit for Dr. Ruparell's paper, but I do have to take the blame for mine. In a secular context, is it still possible for religious traditions to contribute toward meaningful social transformation without giving up that which makes them uniquely religious? This is the question that galvanizes much of my doctoral research in religious studies at the University of Calgary. I think this question is important because in our time, there is a popular notion that religion has reasserted itself in society. A quick perusal of the faith and spirituality section at Indigo Chapters seems to confirm this suspicion, chock full of titles on everything from tarot to American evangelicalism. This apparent resurgence of the spiritual into the secular is why some have claimed that we now live in a post-secular era, a moniker which aims to describe the unexpected flood tide of spirituality back into our culture, of how religion comes to reassert itself in new and surprising ways. Yet is this really a reappearance of religion in our culture, or merely its redescription? The philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues that in the secular climate of late modernity, religion has two possible roles, therapeutic or critical. Quote, it either helps individuals to function better in the existing order, or it tries to assert itself as a critical agency, articulating what is wrong with that order as such, a space for the voices of discontent. This distinction between therapeutic and critical modes of religious engagement is the point of departure for my own research project, which looks at the use of religion in medicine and mental health care. In these contexts, the distinction between the therapeutic and critical roles of religion is more than an academic question and has real-world implications for the ways that we understand and treat patients. I want to look at these two modes of religion in turn. The therapeutic role of religion is a really important one. Religious belief and belonging help people to cope with their situations. In my research on religion in medicine, I pay attention to the enormous body of clinical research from the last few decades that demonstrates the health benefits of religion for patients. But I argue that this research and the adoption of religion and spirituality in medicine more broadly is really only concerned with therapeutic types of religion, i.e. those which help patients to cope without threatening to rock the biomedical boat. Describing certain forms of modern religion as therapeutic is, I think, a more helpful and generous perspective than the hackneyed complaint that religion has been privatized. Those arguments often overlook that religion has not so much been consigned to the private sphere of the individual as it has been reimagined as a different kind of public practice to the one that it has traditionally been, at least in Western society. Religion still has freedom of public expression in our culture. The bookshelves at Indigo Chapters make that much clear. But the character of that public expression is reimagined as being concerned with the formation of self or perhaps aesthetic expression. People start to think of religion more in the ways they think of art and music than the ways they think of politics. This is something of what the theologian Nicholas Lash was getting at when he said that religion in our culture is allowed to be about the beautiful. Sometimes it's even allowed to be about the good. What is excluded by the dominant ideologies is any suggestion that the business of religion is about public truth. An approach to religion that is about the beautiful and the good is what I describe as a therapeutic type, and it has important contributions to make to our public life. It can make people better citizens and neighbors. And as I said, it can be a powerful mechanism for coping and flourishing. But the problem with constricting the public presence of religion to a solely therapeutic function is simply that religious traditions and religious people are stubbornly resistant to it. Religion is about truth, and more often than not, it understands that truth to be in some way a public matter. In the context of the medical research on religion, the therapeutic religiosity that's euphemistically labeled spirituality is often cut off entirely from the social critical power of religious traditions. This is a model of religion that helps people adjust to the way things are in the world and in their own situations, but makes no claims upon public truth, morality, or the common good. But as Žižek says, there is another way in which religion asserts itself in late modernity, which is as a critical agency, articulating what is wrong with the current order, a space for the voices of discontent. Is there still space for this kind of critical role of religion? Space for religious traditions to be harnessed in diagnosing what needs to change in society? In the context of mental health care, where much of my research takes shape, can religion or spirituality's therapeutic power for patients be extended to a critique of the societal conditions in which mental health concerns become endemic? This is to ask about the possibility of religious traditions contributing toward meaningful transformation of systems and institutions, that is, toward a common good. As I've entered into doctoral research, I've discovered that not only religion, but the study of religion provides this space for the voices of discontent. The study of religion remains one of the last places in the modern academy in which one can do the work of demythologizing the ideas and institutions that now have the market on public truth, whether political, economic, or social. By examining the stories, communities, and practices that make us human, the study of religion invites us to reimagine what it means to flourish in our time. Because of this, religious studies is intrinsically interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinarity feeds my own research as I bring together religious and medical perspectives in order to foster new understandings of mental health and human flourishing. When religious and non-religious perspectives come together, they can help us rethink whether our current way of living is serving us well, to what extent it allows us to aim at a good life with others in a just society. That's part of the critical role of religious studies, to hold this brave new world up against the tested ways of being in religious traditions, and to ask what the two can learn from one another. Ultimately, though, I think we will need to ask whether this critical role of religion is fundamental to the nature of religion itself, or whether it's only a provisional moment, a necessary but transitory step on the way toward a more robust and generous integration of the religious and the non-religious. Is it really the case that the therapeutic and the critical are the only two options left available for religion in the confused and reactionary space of late modernity? Or could new, more meaningful roles emerge, ones that go beyond simply blending in or pushing back? By paying attention to the ways that religion continues to stubbornly assert itself in society, we can start to answer that question. This, I think, is one of the critical tasks for the study of religion in our time. And this is what it means for religious studies to be a space for the voices of discontent in a way that aims toward a more authentic and fruitful transformation of society. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone for being here tonight. It's really great to see so many people here. I'm going to continue with the diversity theme in what we study and go into historical background about why Buddhism will always continue to be open-ended and evolving. Buddhists often refer to their object of inquiry and devotion as the Dharma, which can mean Buddhist teachings, law, and the nature of reality. The basic premise is that Buddhist propositions can be verified for oneself, though it takes a lot of effort. This is why Buddhism is often concerned with practices in orthopraxy rather than doctrines or orthodoxy. That is not to say that there are no orthodoxies, but we generally have to contextualize any given position within vigorous traditions of debate. The term Dharma, which omits both written and oral reproductions of teachings, does not inherently divide scripture from analysis or distinguish between authentic reception of teachings and authentic teachings. Scholars argue that some decisions attributed to the Buddha in the early Buddhist discourses were particularly important in setting standards of authenticity. First, the Buddha was said to have spoken against monks who wished to fix one language as the correct form for oral transmission, and supported those who argued that monks should be allowed to learn the teachings in their own dialects. Also crucial to early transmission was the practice of spreading recitations of the Dharma through a wandering network of monks who had themselves attained liberation, rather than solely from encounters with the Buddha himself. Monks traveled in small groups but congregated fortnightly to recite the monastic precepts. Recitation practices continued after the Buddha's death, and certain monks were valued as repositories of Dharma that no single monk had heard from the Buddha in its entirety. After the Buddha's death, the distinction between originals and reproductions became more problematic. As Buddhist scholar Ronald Davidson notes, the community of elders was compelled to address the problem of the relationship between the Buddha and the Dharma preached by him. Characteristically, the Dharma was defined as that which was discovered by the Buddha, but was neither invented by him, nor indeed was he the first of the Buddhas. Therefore, the speech of the Buddha embodied the Dharma, yet the Dharma went beyond the speech of the Buddha. The definition of the Dharma was expanded to include words of the Buddha preached by his disciples and the words of a person inspired by the presence of the Buddha. The teachings of the disciples of the Buddha were also sanctioned, which opened the way to include others' teachings when significant and endowed with principle. To determine significance and principle, the litmus test was the ability to show the way to liberation from suffering and delusion, but that efficacy could only be determined by monks in the early days. Thus, the early Buddhist community adopted a functional rather than a formal definition of its own teachings. At the same time, the liberal notion that the salvific function of the Dharma is not dependent on a particular form or person had to be enacted within a conservative context in order to anchor its significance. Toward the end of the first century after the Buddha's death, a ritual pronouncement came into use, whereby teachings were guaranteed by the words, "This is the Dharma, this is the Vinaya," the monastic rules, "this is the teaching of the teacher." A teaching stamped with this oral seal of approval was supposed to have been validated by the reference to 4 great references to authority, whereby a monk could consider a teaching valid if it issued from the Buddha, of course, a group of elders, a group of specialists in one of the scriptures, or an individual specialist. One of the rule books, however, moreover, includes guidelines about how the elders were supposed to judge authenticity. One should see if it conforms to the discourses, is reflected in the rules, and does not contradict reality. Okay, so how do you decide that one, right? Then it can be said, this is the Dharma spoken by the Bhagavan, the Buddha. Other versions of the criteria insisted on verification of the source of a given transmission, but the third caveat introduced above, that the teachings must not contradict reality, raises interesting questions. This caveat, which could contradict the injunction given in the same text to follow transmitted discourses rather than individuals, points to the tension between conservative and liberal criteria. Ronald Davidson again claims that the reality caveat indicates a liberal orientation toward personal validation of the Dharma. For example, through one's own contemplative analysis of the processes of dependent origination. Within the context of increasing formalization of textual authority and protocols for debate. The reality caveat seems to me a tacit admission that the Buddhist scriptures do contain contradictions and invite a wide range of interpretations based on individual experience. Monks were given at least some carefully circumscribed ground from which to claim their own enlightened, if rigorously trained, insight as authoritative. Yet, since only male ordained members of the Sangha at that time were permitted to appeal to personal verification, one must raise this question: how do we take into consideration the mutual influence between doctrines and practices that are already accepted and the spiritual experiences that vest the individual with the authority to interpret and transmit them? Some stories in the early discourses reinforce the idea that the ritual of taking refuge in the Dharma and the rules for behavior should be the basis of the unity of the Buddhist community, regardless of differing versions of teachings and rules. The authority of the historical Buddha remains central, but given a certain agreed-upon set of vows and subject to certain criteria, the gates were opened wide for a range of interpretations and implementations of the teachings. With the turn to a new form, a devotional form, Mahayana, the greater vehicle, in around the 1st century BCE, this included a huge proliferation of visionary and literary elaborations. The one key interpretive lens was whether or not a teaching or practice supported liberation from suffering. The source of suffering is said to be craving, as many of you might know, especially craving for a permanent self-essence, a permanent self, which Buddhists famously claim is an illusion. I'm not going to go into the basic Buddhist teachings here. They can be found on the internet in many venues and formats, and in our classes. My point here is that Buddhism set itself up as a process of physical and moral discipline, meditation, importantly, and acquiring insight that had to be carried out by the practitioner, not accepted on faith. Of course, there are many, many faith-based Buddhist traditions, but this does not contradict the emphasis on realization of the teachings for oneself. The diversity of Buddhisms and practices make this a rich multicultural tradition to teach from. And that's why I love doing it. It never ends. The fluid adaptation, appropriation, and shape-shifting of Buddhism continues in the present, aided and abetted by the internet. Maybe the Turing test should be whether or not androids start dreaming of liberation from delusion-based suffering. Thank you.
First, thank you so much to Carolyn for organizing this panel, and to my colleagues for their insightful comments, and to the library for hosting us, and to you for being here. I did not train in religious studies, so I'm going to start by briefly telling my story of how I came to teach in religious studies, and then talk about why I think religious studies is important, and finally explain my approach to teaching. I earned my PhD in performance studies, an interdisciplinary field that emerged in the 1980s at the intersection of theater and anthropology. When I applied for the PhD, I didn't really know what performance studies was, but I had burning questions about theater and religion, and performance studies seemed like a place to address those questions. My father was a Presbyterian pastor who wrote short plays for our church's vacation Bible school. These plays featured characters from popular culture like Darth Vader and Batman and Robin, and I wish I had old pictures, but I couldn't find any, performed by college students who were working at our church as summer interns. Of course, since these were basically morality plays, by the end of the week of vacation Bible school, the bad guys converted to Christianity. Kids came from the neighborhood and they loved these plays. They packed the sanctuary to see Spider-Man jump from the balcony or Chewbacca save the day. But some church members disliked the plays because the characters were not biblical. In graduate school, I discovered that this anxiety about plays had a name, anti-theatrical sentiment, and stretched all the way back to Plato, gathering force with the early church fathers. I first focused on anti-theatrical sentiment in early modern France because I loved French, and there was a major episode of religious animosity toward the theater in the 17th century. In the archives in Paris, however, I quickly realized that what really fascinated me was less the story of the theater than how the priests who refused sacraments to actors during the Counter-Reformation used performance to craft their ecclesiastical identity. Thanks to that project on early modern French priests, my first tenure-track job was in a French department, teaching medieval and early modern literature. I loved that job, and I still love French, and I love studying the early modern world. However, while I was teaching in a French department and turning my dissertation into a book, I realized that my central questions concerned religion, religious performance. I remember vividly one afternoon writing in my journal that I wanted to find a way to transition to religious studies. And I thought that would take years. But within a year, I had an interview here at the University of Calgary to work in the Department of Classics and Religion. So for me, the opportunity to teach religious studies has felt a little bit miraculous. That does not mean it has been easy, because learning a new field is a huge challenge and there is still so much that I need to learn, but it has been invigorating, and I feel that the study of religion takes us to the heart of things. So scholars debate the origins of the term religion, but all the possible meanings of its Latin root, religio, reveal why religion matters so much. Some argue religio comes from religare, which means to bind. In this sense, traced back to Christian authors in the 3rd century CE, religion binds people to God. Ever since Emil Durkheim's writing on religion in the early 20th century, however, we have recognized that religion also binds people to each other. Other researchers argue that religio meant something like to care or to revere. Scholars find this meaning in Cicero in the 1st century BCE, where religio starts to refer to a distinct and bounded sphere of human behavior with an institutionalized form in which a power structure demands submission and obedience. Before Cicero, though, as Carolyn Barton and Daniel Barwin have shown, religio described a range of emotions arising from heightened attention, including hesitation, caution, anxiety, fear, dread, and awe. Religion, then, functions as a fundamental mode of human organization. By studying religion, we get to the heart of things by uncovering the processes that bind people together in groups and communities, and the intense feelings that motivate human action. To me, approaching religion as performance means paying attention to how bodies and words work together to create worlds or realities. This means I teach my students to analyze how the smallest building blocks of any event, such as objects, spaces, gestures, social or institutional roles, and language, interact to generate feelings of purpose, community, and authority. Religions are not the only organizations to use performance to create cohesion and meaning. But the largest and oldest religious traditions have survived for so long and had such significant impact on human experience, in part because they excel at using performance. In the broadest sense, any action that involves framing or a dynamic of watching and being watched belongs to the category of performance. Theorists identify at least 3 overlapping modes of performance. First, performance can refer to the display of skill. Musicians and athletes perform in this sense by displaying their skill for others. And religious traditions, too, frequently call upon their leaders and followers to display skill, for example, by celebrating the liturgy or memorizing scripture. Second, performance can mean the carrying out of an action in keeping with a standard. We use this sense of performance when we talk about how students perform on a test, or when companies laud their high-performing executives. In religious contexts, adherents often feel compelled to live up to moral or behavioral expectations, which falls into this mode of performance. Finally, performance can involve patterned behavior. This kind of performance includes theatrical role-playing, as well as the enactment of social norms. Performance theorist Richard Schechner defines this type of performance as restored behavior. He thinks all performances, whether artistic, ritual, or social, are made up of strips of behavior that we reuse and sometimes recombine in novel ways. Religions often have very sticky, by which I mean memorable and meaningful, restored behavior. We can think of the sign of the cross in Catholicism, or the gestures that compose Muslim prayer, or the practices of meditation in Buddhism. One way to understand the social and political impact of religion, then, is to analyze religious traditions as complex repertoires of restored behavior. Within a tradition, these restored behaviors intertwine to align experience with doctrine. In Catholicism, for example, the sacrament of ordination performs the idea that when a man becomes a priest, he undergoes a change in being, not just in status. making him able, in Pope Paul VI's words, to act in a special way in the person of Christ. The bishop pours chrism or consecrated oil on the candidate's hands in the sign of the cross, lays hands on his head, and the candidate receives special robes that express his new role. After the ordination, clerical garments, the cassock when out and about, and vestments like the alb, stole, and chasuble when at the altar, continue to perform the priest's identity as separate from the laity. Performance creates the reality of the priest as Christ's vicar. By analyzing religious traditions as performance repertoires, we can also see how restored behaviors circulate, overflowing the traditions that originated them, and becoming cultural resources in domains not associated with religion, but requiring community, purpose, or authority. Likewise, we become attuned to how religious traditions incorporate restored behaviors from other domains. In other words, the boundaries between religion and its other become fuzzier and more nuanced. I will close by sharing how a student in my 400-level course on performing religious authority used these ideas to come up with a great insight about the circulation of restored behaviors in megachurches. He noticed that younger megachurch pastors reject the nice suits that older pastors like Joel Osteen of Lakewood Church in Texas wear to signal wealth and authority, and instead wear sneakers. In a very classic evangelical performance strategy, megachurch pastors adapt a restored behavior, wearing athletic attire, from popular culture. In the same way that Osteen's suit allows him to draw on restored behaviors associated with business success, sneakers enable these younger megachurch pastors to leverage restored behaviors linked with hip-hop and YouTube influencers. But these are not just any sneakers. Megachurch pastors wear designer sneakers with price tags in the hundreds or even thousands of dollars, so that they still enact the prosperity gospel previously enacted by the designer suit. This student's insight helped me see in my new research project, which is about ritual in tech, that Silicon Valley, I forgot a slide. I'm sorry, I forgot. There was another great slide, but it didn't get in here. I'll tell you what it said, what it showed. So this student's insight helped me see in my new research project, which is about ritual in tech, that Silicon Valley CEOs who craft themselves as charismatic figures borrow styles of self-presentation from megachurch pastors. I've been studying this company called Salesforce, and its CEO, Mark Benioff, every time they have a user conference, he has these amazing designer sneakers. And so now I know that those designer sneakers, of course, we don't know which way these repertoires circulated, but that megachurches and CEOs are definitely sharing a repertoire which crosses boundaries that we might think of as boundaries between religion and non-religion. So religious repertoires and their circulation are phenomena that we are wise to heed and that are part of what we get by studying religion as performance. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for sharing the evening with us. I just want to briefly present, I'm imitating how I walk around the classroom, sorry. What underlines the motivation to create and to teach programs that are literally on site and far from here. We are doing great things in Calgary itself, thanks in no small part to the Calgary Interfaith Council, with whom we are sharing this evening. And its executive director, Sarah Arthurs, has been among many, many activities organizing what we call faith crawls, where we visit a series of different religious places of worship. And so too does the University of Calgary through its Faith and Spirituality Center and its Chair of Christian Thought organize similar events. I guess the fundamental difference is that these faith crawls are fantastic because they allow us within our home city to understand our neighbors much more directly and clearly. By going to another country where another language is spoken, another culture is practiced, This, I think, not only allows students to dig very deep into a religious tradition, but it also enables them to live, for however short a period of time, to live another culture and to learn from that, and with the people on the other side to learn from our students. So just to get our bearings here, this is Italy, and we are centered when we've gone in 23 and 24 to the very, very middle of the boot. You can see Rome, which is located right to the left of Italy. And if we were to drive in a straight line from Rome eastward, roughly where the top of the letter A is, this is the town of Sulmona, which is the birthplace of the truly gigantic, figuratively speaking, poet Ovid, who lived on the bridge between the pre-Christian era and the Christian era. He was known as the supreme poet of love, and he describes that love in several of his works, not least a notorious work called The Art of Love. And one of the motivations to bring our students to Sulmona and its surrounding valley is that incredibly bunched together, almost stacked on top of each other, there are places of tremendous cultural and religious importance. So the next 3 or 4 slides are actually within about a kilometer of each other and almost literally going uphill from one to the other. So at the bottom is this very ordinary looking fountain, but which by local tradition is the fountain where Ovid first learned the art of love himself, which he then transmitted in his writings. About 200 yards from here is this massive monastery founded in the 13th century, and that grew and grew until the 19th century, when, like all monasteries in much of Europe, it was shut down and turned into a high security jail. Well, they're very well adapted. They have cells, right? And our students had the opportunity of visiting here and being taken, so to speak, behind the scenes where most visitors aren't allowed to go. And going in a straight line up the mountainside, there are 2 sites I want to point out here. The lower one is the first one you would come to. It's an enormous sanctuary to the demigod or god Hercules. And you can see the terraces on which it was built. The original structure has been destroyed over the millennia since then, but this goes back to pre-Roman times even. So you've got this hierarchy of places, at the top of which is this hermitage named after a hermit saint, Saint Onofrio, and it's here that a hermit lived for the better part of 60 years or so, until at the age of 84, he saw some strange-looking visitors on very rich horses come up to him, and they presented themselves and said, "Guess what, hermit? You are now the Pope." So it's one of these small curios of the history of Christianity. So all of these are almost literally in a line from one another. You know the expression, to dig deep, drill, baby, drill. Well, here you've got to ascend to do the same thing. Our students also visited, and this is what I mean by the hyper-focus of religious culture in a very small area. This is about 8 kilometers from the mountain I just showed you. This is on the outskirts of a town named Corfino today. It is today, has literally a population of 1,000 people, but 2,000 years ago had its own senate of 500 people alone. So it was a massive municipium or city. And we visited this pre-Roman sanctuary, also to Hercules in this spot. And just up the valley from that site at the edge of the town of Corfino is a cathedral. It's hard to imagine a city or town of 1,000 people having a massive 12th century cathedral, but this is what we have here. And I'm very proud to say that one of our students, Charlotte Dover, took this photograph here, which won an international photo contest, winning the first prize. And it's basically what we have here in the land attached to the cathedral is this ancient Roman pillar, which, given its size and magnitude, almost certainly had to be at a religious temple itself. So all these things are piled one on top of the other here, and much of what's in this place is actually composed of things dug from under the ground. This bust that we have here in the local museum is a bust of the Emperor Claudius, and this bust was found in the basement of someone's house on the central piazza. So you can't escape history and heritage in this place. Although we are based almost the entire time in this Central Valley, we do make a couple of excursions to Rome, and this is one of my very favorite places in Rome. It's hard to imagine one that is more greatly exemplifies the layers of Roman religion and Roman history. You walk into this structure here and you see an 18th century facade and you say, well, that's pretty. You go inside and there's a 12th century church that is covered, at least at the altar end, as you can see, with very rich, beautiful mosaics. You go down the stairs and this is a 4th century church upon which the 12th century church was built. And in this space alone, I just point out, there is this fresco here, which is no ordinary fresco. It's from the 8th century. And among other things here, it's kind of like a cartoon life, comic strip life of Saint Clement, one of the very first saints. And this is a very rare work of art, being that old. And also for the history of the Italian language, it's the very first remnant we have of a language that supersedes gradually Latin. And to make it even more interesting, the people right here are swearing at each other, insulting each other in the grossest language. But it's in a church, right? So in this space, we have this first example of the Italian language. We have this ancient altar under which are the relics of St. Clement 2,000 years ago. And in the back, looking almost like nothing, is the altar in which are the relics of the apostle of Christianity in what is today Eastern Europe, Saint Cyril, all in this one space. And to think that was it, that's, that is enough for one church, but this church has more. In the basement, there is the remnants of a rich Roman's house that also served as a school. And this particular room was a temple to the Roman god, also the Eastern god Mithraeus, all in one spot, layer after layer after layer. And I'm sad to say that tourist books are beginning to pick up on this, and it's almost always in the top 10 places to go. So don't go. No, I'm lying. But we also, in a place like this where the religion is lived, we get to practice the religion, at least as a participant. It doesn't mean that one is a believer, but to walk from our hotel to the next town, this one here, Prato la Peligna, is about 5 kilometers, so it's a short walk, but we actually go there as part of the pilgrimage to coincide with the major spiritual event of the day. And I just show this picture because a local here has a poster saying, "Welcome to Pratala, people of Calgary." The final thing I want to point out is this lived aspect again, where we went to this remote hermitage, and while we were there, we bumped into, this wasn't planned, but I wish it were, we bumped into a group of people who had walked from Rome to this almost unknown place in the middle of this mountain valley. And it was such a joy to talk to them, practicing their lived religion, having walked from Rome about 100 kilometers here. And in this very place, our students got to relive the practice of incubation, which is you go under an altar, and ordinarily you would spend the night there in prayer, hoping for a dream that would free you. The last image I want to show you are two here. This is a local feast, also in the valley, where you have a saint's statue being covered by snakes. This combines the pre-Christian religion, the pre-Christian cult of how people here had a reputation for snake charmers, and this saint who freed the people, a little bit like St. Patrick in Ireland. Although he didn't get rid of the snakes, he got rid of their venom. Last thing of all is that being Canadians here brings you into a very privileged situation. The people of Central Italy, and especially this town, love Canadians because in this town, Ortona, they were freed from Nazi occupation by Canadian troops in what for Canadians was the bloodiest battle in Italy. So we are not forgotten. When we are back in Sulmona, the hotel celebrates us, and yeah, this is our group of this year, and I'm very happy that our group has commemorated our stay here by making this T-shirt, which is a sort of roadmap of all of the different sites they visited. So each of these places were ones within a very, very small area that brings together many different, albeit unified under the formal label of Christianity, a great diversity of practice. And they can see this all by engaging in this trip here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, presenters, very much. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. Maybe I could just quickly ask if any of the panelists have questions for one another before we open up to the floor.
So thank you all to the speakers tonight. This was such a different, variety bag of the importance of religious studies. And the question that comes to my mind kind of stems from that variety. So the topics that you all covered all showed a disparate lens towards the importance of religious studies, but there seemed to be this unifying theme of that importance itself. And now that all of you have heard each other's different angles on the importance of this matter, whether it was the lived, embodied experience of the travel studies, or the classroom experiences, or the ins and outs of traditions that we heard about tonight, I'm wondering if any of the speakers would be able to say a piece about how all these different threads connected and unified towards what seems to me to be a central theme of the importance of these different areas.
I think sitting here, inevitably some contributions ring more loudly in our minds than others. While Joy was giving her presentation, I was struck by the what I'm attracted to in my personal research, which is performance. And in my case, it's the speeches that are made, the sermons that are given in religious practices and rituals. To some degree or other, I think we can't, it's impossible to escape religious studies without being conscious of and reflecting upon that performative aspect. So.
I think that Beth's idea that studying religion unravels the monolithic, the ability to see those around us in a monolithic way, I feel like that is maybe at the core. I feel like that's a central thread for all of us, and I really like the way you articulated that. I feel like religious studies pushes us to have a finer grained understanding of our own traditions and of the traditions around us, and I feel like that was maybe a central thread among all of our interventions.
I think that the different presentations and conversations point to what is for me the most important aspect, and that's curiosity. And it's why study of religion and Buddhisms is important, and also being in the classroom, because I can ask students what they think and get little windows into their worlds from their papers. So I really appreciate that opportunity for curiosity where things are not cut and dried. I mean, after all, religion is about who are we, where are we from, what are we doing here? So I think that questioning and open-endedness is a really important space to hold wherever we are.
So it really strikes me that in this era, when we, in a very positive sense, talk a lot, sorry, my cord's a little short, so I'm leaning over. We talk a lot about diversity, and I think there is no more fundamental conduit for diverse identity than religious identity, whether you are a practitioner or not, right? That often language and race and ethnicity really boil down to how do we first learn that from our first teachers, from our parents, is through religion. And so two things really struck me, maybe because I was already thinking about this theme of biography and how religion is part of our lives. First, in Adam's presentation, when he talked about spirituality, there's a great podcast out there if you want to learn more about religion called Keeping It 101 by two American scholars of religion. They have a new textbook out called Religion is Not Done With You, because the slogan of their podcast is, you may be done with religion, but religion is not done with you. You may think that you don't practice, but every time you open your calendar and record the date, you are practicing something that is influenced by religion. It's so fundamental to who we are that we, even if we're not practicing, we don't think about it. The other thing I thought is how each of us had parts of our own story. I have been colleagues with Joy for a decade, and I did not know that her father was a pastor. Some of you in this room have heard me talk about my late father, who was a permanent deacon in the Catholic Church. He was ordained when I was 8. He brought his theology lessons home. I often joke when I teach theories of religion that my first introduction to Marx was being taught liberation theology at the dinner table. I'm sure that has nothing to do with my eventual profession at all. So I think, or even Chris's story of growing up in a small town and being, I'm assuming one of a relatively small number of atheist households or irreligious households. Oh, right, it's Invermere, sorry, they're all atheists. But that we all think of our early identities and how they were shaped by religion, whether we practice or not. So I think that's what ties this together. This is how we unravel, maybe as Joy said, who we are and who the people we interact with are. Sorry, that was a long answer. Now you know how my students feel.
I recall many years ago when Dr. Muessig's predecessor, as the chair of Christian thought, gave his final lecture before retiring about religious studies, basically. And I was quite struck at the time that he traced his career of a change from when he first went into it, I would guess back in the 60s, from kind of a supercilious secularism. Like, isn't this interesting, these primitive people do all of these things, but we're well beyond that now. Through his career to a point of how did he put it? I like the way he put it. Oh dear, and of course I'm down at it. Sympathetic curiosity. That's what it was. And I remember thinking at the time that in religious studies, as opposed to in practice of a particular religion or membership in a particular community, it's important to have one foot inside as an insider and one foot as an outsider. And I think various things that each of you has said tonight has really done that. If you're not part of the performance, what are you? And how do you define your role within the performance as an insider? And yet, how do you have a non-schizophrenic observation of it from the outside? And it seems that when one approaches the study of religions comparatively, that's a dance that constantly has to be done, because I think it's difficult, as you say, not to come out of it without being some kind of a religious, define one's own religiosity. Now, where I can get a question out of this, I'm not quite sure, but I was struck by this same lecture series, having taken that approach. Oh gosh, how long have you been here? 5 years, so it would have been 8 years ago about, because it was a bit of an interregnum there. But do you, as religious studies professionals, do you see that same kind of thing and continuing along those same lines?
Do you mean the foot in, foot out? Is that what you're referring?
How do you negotiate that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So coming from performance studies, well, I'd be really interested to hear what people who trained in religious studies think. But coming from performance studies, I've often thought it's interesting because religion is a subject for which, at least coming from these other fields, it was not legitimizing to have any personal connection to the subject, and that having any kind of personal connection to the subject would jeopardize the validity of one's research. Whereas there are other subjects where having a personal connection to the subject, for example, race or gender, is very legitimizing. And so my sense is that the field struggles with that question. So I'd be really interested to know what other people think. So I really like the way you talked about having one foot in and one foot out. And certainly because what I understand our field to do is to analyze and try to understand these traditions. It's not working from a faith perspective, so that you do need that distance. And so that foot in and foot out, I think, is important. But I also think that, at least coming from performance studies and then early modern French studies has all of this research about these polemics between the theater and the church. But most of that research is written by theater scholars who are French and have this deep antipathy toward religion. And because of that antipathy, they didn't look at the other scholarship that talks about the Counter-Reformation. So there was a blind spot there. And because I'd had an experience growing up in the church, not in a Catholic church, but in a Protestant church, I had maybe that sympathy for what it might have been like to be a priest. And the other scholars hadn't asked that question because of their own cultural framing. So yeah, that foot in and foot out, I think, is important. And I like that idea of the sympathetic curiosity.
I might say something. Yeah, I think for me, as someone who came out very much of a tradition of being in and studying from within, my background's in theology, and then moving to religious studies is perhaps more on the surface, being on the outside looking in at religion. But I think what I've learned from studying it at U of C is that as you study it, the lines between what constitutes in and out become blurred. And it's not absolutely clear what it means to be in a tradition, which is a real challenge, I think, for religious students when they begin that endeavor of studying it in that way. But it's also a challenge to people who think that they're outside of religion looking in. And I think Beth mentioned that already, right? That religion might not be done with you in the ways that you think. And so in the research that I'm doing at the moment, looking at this idea of spirituality in medicine and what that word attempts to achieve, and the sort of the theoretical work it tries to do, it's, I think, often draws out of this sense of, well, we don't really know what to do with religion anymore. It feels like to be engaged in religion and to speak in those ways is inherently prejudicial, and it disallows objectivity. So instead, we can sort of play with terms and talk instead about something that on the surface seems much more inclusive because more universal. But actually, I think when you dig into what we mean when we talk about spirituality, we're just talking about religion in a different way. And so for me, I think it's helpful sometimes, to think of religion not as a subset of this universal concept of spirituality, but actually the other way around, that when we talk in our culture about spirituality, that's a subset of religion, what we've always called religion, but don't maybe really know what to do with anymore. So I think religious studies allows us to blur those lines and say, perhaps you're not as in one camp as much as you think you are. Perhaps you're already engaged in religious belonging without realizing, and you can sort of allow the study to reveal that and disclose that for you, I think.
Thank you very much. We're actually almost out of time. There's one more question up there. Is that? Yes, one more question at the top.
I just wanted to thank the panelists for being here today, but also been kind of gauging which question I wanted to ask, so I'll ask the shorter one. In my studies of religion, I come from a very agnostic, science-focused background, so most of my interpretations of practices or whatnot, I have a very hard time not seeing certain rituals or beliefs or practices that I can tell have been derived from experience or practice or scientific basis. So say like washing your hands before going into church, you do that to clean yourself. Like there was miasma and corruption in ancient Greece and whatnot. So I guess my question is, when learning or researching religions or even spirituality, because a lot of the indigenous scholarship that I've learned from, it's not religion, it's their spirituality and their way of life and practice. How do you keep yourself, I guess, from not maybe disrespecting intentionally, but unintentionally maybe infantilizing when you see I see where you came from with that, and I can see the point of views and the perspectives and the backing and basis behind that, and maybe keeping while you're researching an understanding that it is still a religious view, it is still a spiritual view, there is still belief behind it. It's not just I guess practice. It's not all just things that you do that make sense, I guess.
I can try. Yeah. So how do you avoid that sort of pragmatic approach where you just treat it as a fact that has no maybe inherent deeper meaning in it, which is very infantilizing, I think. I've been sort of ankle deep in reading Paul Ricoeur for the last few months, philosopher. And so he would say the symbol gives rise to thought. The symbol sets us thinking. So the thought doesn't get there first, right? So we don't say, okay, we need to wash our hands because it's the safe thing to do. And then a practice emerges around that. Even if historically that's the sequence of events, actually what comes to happen is the symbol becomes more fundamental to it. And so for us, it's the study of the symbol, I think, that allows us to make sense of ourselves and our communities and our practices more broadly. And I think that's a way of allowing for a kind of genetic reading of religion where we can say, I wonder where that ritual came from, a sort of archaeological reading, but it also recognizes the inherent value of the symbol, that to know where it came from doesn't change the fact that it's still primary to the way that we get around in the world, that we orient ourselves by symbols and narratives and stories. And so when we try to pick them apart, we're not dissecting them to understand the sort of core cold objectivity that they come from. We're trying to make sense of how these frame us, how they shape us. What Joy talked about with performance. How does that performance shape us? How does it make us think about what it means to be religious or to be human or to be Canadian or whatever? So I think that maybe is a way of approaching that where we can do both. We can treat it pragmatically and archaeologically, but we can also recognize that that symbol is the source of our own values and meaning. And so we're kind of doing both at the same time.
Thank you so much. We are out of time, and but clearly there's a lot to talk about. And when you came in, I hope you saw a piece of paper up there that announces the next Chair of Christian Thought event, which will be the 25th of April, and co-organized with Grace Presbyterian Church. Dr. Norman Wurzber will be coming to Calgary to talk about hope and food sustainability. So do have a look at that. And also we're inviting people to come and engage with us to talk more about, you know, the future of teaching religious studies and gathering insights from you and your impressions of how it should be taught in higher education. So we're looking for focus groups to discuss that. The information, again, is on the sheet of paper that I hope you picked up. If you don't have one, you could come see me at the end. Before we thank the speakers, I just want to say that the executive director of the Calgary Interfaith Council has a couple of announcements to make. I think you might need a microphone, so there you go. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, panelists. That was just such a rich conversation, and I just kind of wanted to spend more time with each of you and kind of talk more about what you were offering. So thank you very much. Yes, United Nations World Interfaith Harmony Week began on February 1st and will be concluding for us a little bit longer than a week. We're hosting a final concert at Scarborough United Church at 2:00, and there will be spoken word and music from different faiths, as well as a guest Congolese drummer. So you're all invited to that event. Sunday, this coming Sunday. So you're welcome to that. And I will be at the back with some cards with our email address. So you're welcome to check us out and find out what other amazing things we're up to. And I'll just invite you also to book May the 8th, where we have an interfaith breakfast that we host with the Office of the Mayor. So you're welcome to come to that as well. And thank you, Carolyn. It's so wonderful to partner with you on these lectures. So they really add a whole other flavor and dynamic to our week. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. And let's thank. And we can continue our conversation at the top here. We have refreshments and some food. So please join us for a further conversation. Thank you very much.